I work in a variety of mediums, I always have. I have a hard time trying to just narrow down to one medium. For the last 8 years, I've worked primarily in fabric and textiles, but I've always brought this same idea that human beings aren't placed, they bring place into being. So by using different mediums, different materials, everybody has an attachment to a certain material piece, t-shirt, dress, lace, embroidery, traditional textiles. And by sort of meshing them all together, my goal is to create something that sort of brings you to a place of recognition, a place of vulnerability, maybe you wouldn't touch it. So I did that for a really long time. I made a lot of dresses, actually, wearable work, did a lot of performance work as well. And then within the last year or so, I started moving into more painting. So the work that you see is still so new to me, and it's hard for me sometimes to talk about it, to say like, okay, this is what I was thinking with it, but the best way I can describe it is that it came from a place of quietness in my life. Because when I created it, it was when my kids were asleep or my daughter was napping, in between all the roles of like mom, going to school, doing all these things, making dinner, cleaning the house, doing the jobs that we all do. And so it kind of occupies a space that's different from my daily life. It's like what's been going on in my head all day long for the last 6 months. It's these places, there's a lot of really meticulous mark making, something that I started doing many years ago in my textile work, which originated like as a way to sort of cover a large area quickly. But what it became was a meditation. It was like this quiet moment. I'd sit and just make hash marks, or get to a place where all of a sudden the hash marks were starting to sort of break out of the place that I wanted them to sit, and then I'd make a pause and say, oh, this needs a wash over it to create another layer, so I can go back into it and do another layer on top.
Tell us more about your textiles.
My textiles. So when I was in grad school, I was painting a lot in oil paints. And I became pregnant, and I didn't want to work with anything that was toxic. So I had been painting these huge, large-scale portraits of friends of mine, and I met this artist in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Her name's Helen Miranda Wilson. And she actually came to visit me in the studio, and she was looking at my stuff, and we were commenting about the toxicity of oil painting. She was like, you need to get into something else, and oh, by the way, your paintings suck. And I loved her because she was like, always to the point, no BS. She was always saying exactly what she thought. I respected her work, I respected her opinion, and I don't always take some criticism like that lightly, but then she said, you see this drawing over here? This is really nice, and you draw like a sculptor, and I think you should make a sculpture. So she gave me my first assignment, which was make a sculpture out of whatever you want. And so because I was trying to keep away from toxic things, I had a bunch of fabric that I had brought with me into my studio there, and I started making a muslin fabric sculpture of a person. So it was this stitched soft sculpture, and I had more connection in the physical making and holding of the fabric and sewing than I did of painting, that it was like, this is it. And then that became a whole new mode of making for me, and it was fantastic. And I started, so after that, it was exclusively working in textiles for just about 8 years. And it led to not just wall pieces, like these pieces that you see, these are wall pieces that I made. I finished this one just recently, but that was sort of the most, that's been on the wall in my studio for a little over a year in process. But what I do with the textile work is I'll make these pieces and not really know what to do with them and set them to the side. And then start to sort of build up these piles of fabric. A lot of the times they end up as a dress because I'm really interested in sort of the pageantry that textiles have in designing. And so they'll end up in a dress of some sort. And anybody who's seen me work, it's like, it'll be like a mess. And then all of a sudden it's like click, 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 click. And it's like this goes here and sew it on. And this goes here and sew it on. And it's like, it'll brew in my brain for months before it takes like a matter of days to put it together. Yes.
Can you talk about your performance art?
Yes. So I do performance art as well, and that also comes from a sort of sense of vulnerability and pageantry and sort of creating personas that are me but aren't me, or are a facet of myself. In 2010 to 2011, I did a year-long project where I wore a dress every single day for a month, and I changed it daily. I added to it, took things away from it. And I did it, so I changed it up every month, so every month had its own dress. And it originally started off as this idea of how can I had my son, he was just about 2 years old. I was trying to figure out where I was in my studio practice, what direction I wanted to move in, and I wanted to do something that really had meaning to me. And so the premise was, how do I incorporate my art into my daily life, and my daily life into my art, and sort of, marry them together. And what ended up happening was that each month started to create an alter ego as the dress started to change. And it changed seasonally because in Vermont it gets cold in the winter, so sometimes there was a sweater added, or I had one dress that, and I should say they all had names. And sometimes when I talk about them, it sounds like I have multiple personality because I'll be like, so Cupcake was wearing this thing, because I felt like I embodied the name that I gave the dress at the end of the month. So there was this dress called Cupcake, and when I was Cupcake, she had this trapunto layer. Now trapunto is it's a traditional quilting technique where you make an incision, you actually sandwich two pieces of fabric together, you sew a decorative design, you make an incision on the back, and you stuff it with some sort of cotton or fill, and then you sew it together. The really great trapunto masters never had to make an incision. They could actually pull apart the threads, stuff it, and pull the threads back. I didn't have that patience. But this dress had these layers of trapunto, so she really came out as this kind of confection, and I wore her all February. And I'd be in the grocery store. The performative aspect of it was that I would go out in my daily life, I would teach classes wearing these things, and people would ask me questions. I had a business card that said, the dress I'm wearing is a work of art, you can find out more. I kept a blog about it, photographed it, wrote a lot about the process, because one of the interesting things that happened was that I kind of used it as a wearable visual diary as well. And so sometimes there are little things that I would stitch to remind me of a moment. We had a couple of important people to us pass away that year, and I would sort of do something to commemorate them. In the end, I was so used to putting on these dresses as a daily project that I was kind of like, I don't know, after a year I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do now. Like, what am I gonna do? Who am I? I've been these people. And the way the project ended was that she, the dress, essentially broke up with me. I was on my way to a gala at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts with my family, and I had known a bunch of curators that were gonna be there, sort of prepped them about the dress, the project, and it was just about to end. It was 2 days away from ending. I was at my brother's house, and we're trying to get the dress on, and the zipper's getting stuck, And I'm like, David, my brother, I'm like, can you help me? I can't get this, it's just us, you gotta help me. And he pulled the zipper out. And it was just like, well, and at that moment, it was like the project was over. So, and that's, I think, as an artist and as a performance artist, we create these parameters of how things should go, but they don't always necessarily go according to plan. And that's part of it.
So you like a dress is like really inherently like feminine kind of thing? Was that like a conscious decision to
Yes.
do like a womanly dress?
Yes. My work is feminist in nature. And I say that because for years I've avoided saying that. Because I felt like, oh, there's this idea of what feminism is and what it means. But a dress, for me, personally, I connect to because I grew up in Houston. Part of my family in Houston was connected to a social circle where we would go to functions and I would have dresses that I would have to wear that were made for me for these functions, as a child all the way up until an adult. And the dress was something I never felt comfortable in, and I wanted to know why, what about it was uncomfortable for me. And I realized that there's a cultural and a social idea of a dress. A dress can be sexy, it can be plain. There's all these adjectives that can describe a dress or the sort of femininity behind it. And using that as sort of like an icon made it easier for me to sort of, it's almost like using that as my canvas, for me to sort of describe who I was. And now when I look back on it, that time period in art making, in textiles and in performance art, I wasn't the only person doing that. There were other artists. There was a woman in Colorado, her name was Amy Karen. She did a project that was called The Commitment. She wore a wedding dress every single day for over a year. She was originally gonna do it for a year, over a year. And she was a performance artist, but she was also like a sculptor who would do these huge steel sculptures and would be wearing a wedding dress with a hard hat on these lifts. So she was doing that. There was also a project that was called the Little Black Dress Project that was started that was about sort of simplifying a woman's life. But there was also more of a social mission behind that. There were, Andrea Zattel was another artist, although she was much earlier on. She did the AZ project with wearing a dress every single day to sort of simplify her life and compartmentalize it. Yes.
You know, the hash marks. I was just looking at one of the things I have by Clark, and he has a lot of hash marks. So I was wondering, I mean, when did you start with the hash marks? And
the hash marks started in the textiles. So the hash marks were just sewing stitches. Yeah, just stitches across the thing. They made their way into the ink drawings almost by accident. I was trying to, as I was getting back into ink, I was actually going for like, how can I do something that's beautiful and simple and, like a Japanese ink wash meditation. And then like this other part of me was like, it would look really nice if I just took a pencil line and went back there.
Yeah, your both your textile and your painting have so much detail. I was wondering, do you tend to finish one piece before you move on to the next, or do you kind of parallel and let some rest and work on something else?
I do a lot of parallel stuff because it takes, I would say it takes a while to figure out where I'm going with it. With the drawings and the paintings, they kind of happen in tandem because when I do these layered washes, these sort of thin washes, I try to get as many layers of gouache or ink on them as possible to create this sort of depth. So I'll do one, set it aside to dry, I'll do another one. So there will be like a night where I have like 6 panels sitting out just waiting to dry. With the textile work, it happens a little more, it's like I'll create a segment of it, step away from it, create another segment, and then start to sort of piece them together at one time, if that makes sense.
Interesting, yes, thank you.